Good morning, everybody. Welcome again. If this is your first time here, or if, even your second time, third time, welcome. It's great to celebrate this Easter holiday with you. And I hope you enjoyed some of the music that our wonderful community has been able to offer up. We're, of course, here today to celebrate Easter, right? The rising of Jesus from the dead. And I remember, I always think back to my Easters growing up as a child. I grew up in the South in America. And if you know anything about that, you know that Easter is a day where you put on your absolute best clothes when you go to church. My mom had all those big hats that you always see. And I think every year it got bigger. She got a bigger and bigger hat. By the time I went to college, you probably could see it from space. We did an annual picture every year. We got the family together, me and my three siblings, my mother and my father. We have the annual Easter picture. And you know, when you're the youngest of four, every year you can see the migration of hand-me-down outfits going down from the oldest son, down to me. By the time it got to me, it was all worn and ratty. It was either a blue leisure suit or a yellow leisure suit or something like that. Always a leisure suit. It was always big collars and everything. Why do I tell you this? Because Easter's festive. We're here to have a party. I mean, usually at church, we talk about serious subjects and a little dour, but Easter, of course, it's a celebration. It's a party today. This is what we're going to do. And even after service, we're going to have a party downstairs, and we're going to celebrate. But here's the thing. From all these readings that we've done, you can start to see that for the early followers of Christ, for these people who encountered Jesus, it wasn't about leisure suits or big, colorful hats or wearing your best outfits. It wasn't about Easter egg hunts. It wasn't about festivity. It wasn't about that celebration. Actually, most of the disciples, almost everybody who meets Jesus after he rises from the dead, is utterly confused. They don't get it. They've been told about it by him for so long, but they don't get it. Even in this passage today, we'll look at Mary. She doesn't even recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener. Most all of his disciples were confused, and they just stumbled over this. Why? Because this concept of a resurrection is extremely heavy, extremely hard to get our heads around, and yet it's the most imperative thing to get your head around. See, St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that if you don't believe in the resurrection, and if you don't rest in the resurrection, if you don't know that it really happened, then really the rest of the Bible, just forget it. Just take it out. Just get rid of it all. It's pointless. Paul says you have to come to grips and terms with the resurrection first. And actually, in the early church, we know that the early church spread like wildfire. It went from Jerusalem and it spread over to Rome and took over Europe and just kept spreading and spreading. Why? It wasn't because people were going around giving Jesus' teachings. They weren't just going around saying, turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, forgive and forget. Those are good teachings. No, the early church fathers, the early preachers were going around and they were saying, listen, he's alive, and we saw him, and that's changed everything in our life. Everything. See, on Easter, it's easy to get caught up in the festivities, but we have to get back to the resurrection. And we'll look at this today. What does it do to Mary, and what can it do for you and me who have Mary all inside of us? We'll get to Mary in a second. First, let's tackle the 800-pound gorilla that's in the room, okay? The first thing you got to do before we get to Mary is we got to look at this whole resurrection business to begin with. Because there's many, and even many in the church, who have the idea that the resurrection, while a nice story, is just that. It is a story, an allegorical, symbolic meaning of hope that we take. And we have to actually ask ourselves, did this thing actually happen? And is that what they were trying to communicate? Is John, when he wrote this, is he trying to tell us a story that really, really happened, or just some fictional, symbolic thing to give us hope and to make us feel good on Sunday, on Easter morning? So let's look at this honestly, okay? Honestly asked this morning, did this resurrection, could it have happened? Did it happen? And here's some arguments that are against it, and let me go through these rather quickly. First, many people who look at the story of the resurrection will say something like this. Yeah, but those people believed that because they were superstitious. That was an ancient culture. You know, we're scientifically savvy in our postmodern era, aren't we? We're enlightened. They were uneducated. So of course they would have believed in the resurrection. It's an ancient belief. It's antiquated. That's what they believed. They were superstitious. We are not. We are enlightened. They didn't know any better. Oh, really? Wait. Wait and see what people are going to say about you and me 2,000 years from now. What will people 2,000 years from now look back on us and say? If we look back on them 2,000 years ago and say, oh, they were gullible and naive and they believed the resurrection because they were a superstitious culture. Really? What will people say in 2,000 years about us now? See, it's not fair to discount the resurrection simply because it happened in the past and you say, well, that was an antiquated culture. They were uneducated. We're not. We know better now. We know resurrections can't actually happen. Because 2,000 years from now, people are going to be looking back at you and me saying, do you believe they use these things called smartphones? And they call them smartphones? How dumb is that? See, there's a great line. You can get a lot of wisdom from Men in Black. And there's a great line in there. If you ever remember the movie Men in Black, you can laugh, but there's good wisdom here. Because you remember when Agent K, Tommy Lee Jones' character, he introduces the aliens. He shows Agent J, Will Smith's character, that there are indeed aliens on the planet. And they sit down, and Agent J, his mind is blown, and he can't grasp it. And Agent K, Tommy Lee Jones, looks at him and says, you know what, 1,500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was flat. And 5 minutes ago, you thought you knew that we were alone on this planet. What will you know tomorrow? See, it's not fair to discount the resurrection in Agent K's wisdom because look, 1,500 years ago, they knew they were the center of the universe, and now they don't. What will people know 2,000 years from now? So how dare you look back and scoff at that culture? Well, then next, scientific proof. Okay, this is where we get into the meat of the matter. This is what I like. Okay, somebody says, listen, science proves that resurrections can't happen. It's a scientific fact. Oh, really? Because, and one day I'm going to get burned for this because there's actually going to be a real scientist in the room who's going to raise their hand and I'm going to have to talk to them, and that's fine too. But you know this, here's the whole point. You know what the point of science is? It's to define the natural order of things. So therefore, you can't use science to explain something that's supernatural, that's above nature. See, science tells you the natural order of the things. The sun rises, the sun sets, water flows, blood is in our body. That's the natural order of things. It's not fair to use science. I'm not discounting science, but it's not fair to use that to discount the resurrection because it's meant to explain the natural order of things. And by the very definition of the resurrection being a miracle, it's supernatural. Well then, you say, just look at history, Pastor. There's never been any resurrections. There have, but just go with the argument. Say that there's never, historically we know there's never been resurrections. Now you come along with this story about Jesus rising from the dead. Historically, it can't be true. And I'll say, oh, really? Because if you know anything about historical inquiry, every time you come to history, every time you and I approach historical inquiry, we come to it with a bias. And I put in a quote from C.S. Lewis here in his book, Miracles. He writes about miracles, and here he makes an interesting point. He says this: many people think that one can decide whether a miracle occurred in the past by examining the evidence, quote unquote, according to the ordinary rules of historical inquiry. But the ordinary rules cannot be worked until we have decided whether miracles are possible, and if so, how probable they are. For if they are impossible, then no amount of historical evidence will convince us. If they are possible but immensely improbable, then only mathematically demonstrative evidence will convince us. And since history never provides that degree of evidence for any event, history can never convince us that a miracle occurred. Here's what he's saying. When you and I approach historical evidence, we approach it with our bias about whether that thing could actually exist. And here's a silly example. I try to give it every once in a while to make sure you guys are paying attention, which most of you look like you are. If I told you that outside this church right now, there's a tree that gives birth to monkeys. Okay, work with me here. A literal tree that gives birth to monkeys, and it's right outside this church. Now, before you even go to see or can believe whether that tree can actually give birth to monkeys, you've already made up your mind about whether it's possible for a tree to give birth to monkeys, right? You've already said in your head, it's not possible. I've never seen a tree give birth to monkeys. And so therefore, what C.S. Lewis is saying is, no amount of demonstrative evidence is going to prove that to you, because even if I take you to that tree, you're going to say, Pastor, that's a trick. Somebody's behind that tree pushing out monkeys. I did that silly example to get your attention. The tree, this is what C.S. Lewis is saying. He says, let's be intellectually honest with ourselves. We never approach history without a bias about whether that thing could have actually happened or not, he says. Well, lastly, there's a lot of criticisms about the resurrection, and they're all good to talk through. One of the big ones, though, is this. Many people say, well, listen, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these guys were writing these books well after Jesus died. And they were writing these books to support the institution of organized religion. They were using these books to support the church. Okay. But look closely at this story today, and look at this key figure in Mary. Mary is the first eyewitness of Jesus rising from the dead in all the Gospels. And let me tell you this, if I'm John, and I'm writing this book, and I want you to believe my story, that Jesus rose from the dead, I would never in a million years pick this woman. Why? Because we know a couple things about Mary. First, she's a woman. And in this time, women couldn't even testify in a court of law. They were second-class citizens. You would have never used them to prove your story. Secondly, Mary, as when we first met her in the book of John, Jesus takes out demons from her. She is crazy. She's a mental patient. She's what we would call certifiably insane at one point in her life. And also because Mary, her last name is Magdalene, meaning she came from the city of Magda, which probably meant, because what Magda was most famous for was prostitution. And so the legend says that Mary was probably a prostitute, or probably an insane prostitute. She wandered the streets half-dressed. Now listen, if you're John, and you're trying to support organized religion and prove that Jesus rose from the dead, you'd be an utter fool to use this woman as your witness. Let me put it this way. If you guys have come to Soul Grace, you know that I've told you a couple times, I'm a really good dancer. I am. Don't laugh. That's not the joke. The joke's coming. I'm actually a pretty good dancer. I'm older now. I've got some wear on the tires, so it's not so good, as good as it was before, but I still am a good dancer. Now, if I tell you I'm a really, really, really good dancer, and you say, okay, Pastor, tell me somebody who can vouch for you. And I say, go ask my daughter. You would look at me, wouldn't you look at me and say, well, that's insane. Why would you use your 3-year-old daughter as an example or testimony to the fact that you can dance? Wouldn't you surely use some dance instructor, some choreographer? And I say, no, go talk to my 3-year-old daughter. See how insane that was? And it would have been just as insane for John to say, Jesus has risen from the dead, and if you want proof, go talk to that Mary lady. But he does. And so let's look at Mary this morning. There's 3 things that happen in this story. There's a mistake, there's a voice, and there's an embrace. Here's what happens to Mary at the tomb, and this is what happens with you and me whenever we approach God. The same thing happens to us. And he offers us the same grace that he offers Mary. First, the mistake. Go back to your Bible if you want. Mary comes to the tomb, and what does she do, okay? She starts weeping. She thinks the body's been taken. She's confused. She says, she's actually getting indignant to the gardener. She says, tell me where he is, and I'll go get him. She said, where did you do with the body? She's looking for the dead Jesus. Now, why is this strange? Because Mary had been with Jesus for years. She had heard all of his stories about how he was going to die and then how he was going to come alive again in 3 days. And in 3 days, she goes to the tomb and she still's not expecting it. She's still expecting Jesus to be right where she thinks he's going to be. You see what's going on here? Mary had all the information about Jesus, but she had none of this sensation of Jesus. She knew all about him in her head. She knew where he was going to be. She knew that he would die. She went to the tomb. Here's what she did. Mary went to the tomb with her expectations of what Jesus was going to be like. She went to the tomb with her expectations of who Jesus was and where he was going to be. She had all the information, but none of that sensation. See, the mistake that you and I often make, that we can rectify here on Easter morning, the mistake that you and I often make is that when we go to God, we go to him with our expectations, saying, dance to my tune, be where I'm going to find you, fulfill my needs, satisfy what I want, give me that job, give me that relationship, give me that thing, and then I'll believe you. And this is exactly what Mary does. She goes to the tomb and finds it empty, and she's befuddled because she had an expectation about what Jesus was going to be like, and he was about to blow her mind. And he does so with a voice. Now, The mistake is to go to the tomb with your expectations. Mary does that, but then Jesus gives us its voice. Remember, he talks to her. He starts to give her. He starts to give her hope. He says, Mary, and all of a sudden she's crushed and she's moved by this. Why is she so moved? Here's how I like to picture it. If you're a Les Miserables fan, then you know the story. You remember the story of Fantine. You remember this? Fantine has shaved her head. She's gone into prostitution. She's gotten rid of her 2 front teeth so she could try to give money for her daughter. She's been ravaged by these men. She's lost all hope. She stands like Mary at the tomb and she's weeping. She's weeping. And do you remember what she sings? She says, I dreamed a dream in time gone by when hope was high and life worth living. I dreamed that love would never die. I dreamed that God would be forgiving. But the tigers come at night with their voices soft as thunder as they tear your hope apart. As they turn your dream to shame, he slept a summer by my side. He filled my days with endless wonder. He took my childhood in his stride. But he was gone when autumn came. And still I dream he'll come to me, that we will live the years together. See, Mary was just like a Fantine. All hope was lost. She was crying her eyes out. And Mary would have certainly said, listen, I dreamed a dream, but time's gone by. She says, I wanted it. Who did what Fantine want? She wanted her Jean Valjean. She wanted her rescuer. And she saw no hope. And Mary sits at the tomb, and she's lost all hope. And then she hears the voice. She hears Jesus say her name. And you know what's interesting about this? Mary doesn't know. Mary has the angels right in front of her. She has Jesus right behind her, breathing down her neck, and still she doesn't get it until he speaks to her. He says her name. See what this is, the voice this morning. The voice of Jesus here is giving us grace. When he says our name, when he says your name, he says it in the most endearing and embracing way that you could have. This is why Mary turns to him, and she instantly gets it. She doesn't understand what's going on until she hears her name. See, when I was growing up, Shakespeare's got it wrong. Sorry, a rose by any other name does not smell as sweet, and this is why. When I was growing up, if I heard my mother yell down the street, Aric Lawrence Allen, that's my name. But I knew what was coming. I knew what was coming. If I heard Aric Lawrence Allen, that's my name, yeah. But I knew what it meant. But you see, on my wedding day, when I heard my wife say my name, as she read her vows, it's an entirely different embrace. I knew what was coming from my mama. When she said my name that way, that was trouble. When my wife said my name that way, that was an embrace. And look, this morning, Jesus looks at Mary and he looks at you and me, and he says, you bring all your expectations to me. You want me to dance to your tune. Instead, I won't ask you to clean up your life before you come to me. I'll softly whisper your name. See, this is grace. Grace is when you and I go to Jesus, we go to God with our expectations and our list, our agenda, and he says, oh yeah, really? Here, I'm going to tell you your name in a way that you've never heard it before. And this is why Mary is so struck. But in the end, there's something interesting that goes on. There's an embrace. After Jesus says her name, Mary holds on to him. And there's a part where Jesus says, stop, let go of me. But you know what he's saying here? He's not saying, don't touch me, I'm too holy for you. He's not really saying that, because later on what he does with Thomas is he says, Thomas, if you want to touch me, go ahead. So he's okay with the touching. Actually, in the Greek, this verb means that Mary was clinging to him so tightly. And she shouts out Rabboni, meaning teacher. And what Jesus is trying to say here with this whole business of don't touch me, I haven't gone up to heaven yet, is he's trying to say this: Mary, you want me to be your teacher, but I'm here to tell you on Easter morning, I'm so much more than that. Mary wanted Jesus to be the old Jesus that she knew, her rabbi, her teacher, her spiritual guide. And he says, listen, that's religion. Religion says you could follow these rules, follow these moral codes, and then God will love you. And he says, Mary, this morning, I'm not here for that. I'm here to say your name unlike you've heard it before. I'm here to touch you in a way that you've never been touched before. I'm here to rescue you. I'm here to save you. Jesus was the ultimate Jean Valjean, because at the moment of ultimate hopelessness, when Mary lost everything, Jesus says, look, I will embrace you in a way that you've never been embraced before. I'm so much bigger than you could imagine. You want me to be your teacher. I want to be your king. See, what this does this morning, if you do believe in the resurrected Jesus, and if you're willing to let him speak your name, if you're willing to let him be your king rather than you be his king, if you're willing to bow to him and weep with him like Mary did, if you're willing to do that, what it does is, it means that you've let go. You can let go of all that fear, of all that anxiety, of all that worry. You can let go of all your expectations of what God should or should not do for you. Can let go of the expectations of what other people should or should not do to you. Jesus is here this morning saying, listen to me, say your name. And if it shakes you into your heart the way I say your name, you'll be forever changed. Jesus says to Mary, you made a mistake because you came with the expectations of me. But he says, by grace, I give you my voice, and I give you an embrace unlike any other. Just let it go, he says. Let it go, because on the cross, he let it go for everyone. On the cross, Jesus took all the things that you're worrying about right now, all the things that you struggle with in your heart, all the ways in which you feel either that you're too low, that you're too unworthy, that you're not measuring up to the right level. Jesus took all of that and he put it on the cross. And now, on Easter morning, he rises to say your name. Take some time this morning to reflect on that. This is the gospel. That though you and I bring nothing to the table, that you and I have all the expectations of what God should be doing to dance to our tune, he says, really? Come to me as your king, hear your name, and you will be forever changed on Easter morning. Take time to reflect on this gospel truth.